Hi, everyone. Alina from Arcadier here. Today on Inspire, we have Nick Coster, co-founder and head of training at Brainmates, a professional product management consulting and training services company. Hi, Nick. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm awesome. So maybe you can just tell a little bit about yourself to everyone and what you'll be presenting today.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, my name is Nick Coster from Brainmates, one of the co-founders. Well, I've been a product manager for over 20 years, working in a wide variety of different organisations and industries. When we started Brainmates nearly 15 years ago, product management was going through quite a lot of change. So we've seen product management change from being managing fairly static products to really managing the digital revolution and becoming more and more important in many organisations. So today we're going to have a quick talk about the concept of product market fit, which is really important to both organisations that have existing products, but also organisations that are looking to start up in new markets or have new products, and how it can be challenging and how you actually have to do it twice to be successful.
Awesome. Looking forward to it.
So my talk today is about product market fit. How do you know you have it and what comes next? As I mentioned, my name is Nick Coster. We're the co-founder and head of training here at Brainmates. If you want to get in contact with me, my details are here for you. Very quickly about Brainmates, we teach product management and we also consult in product management. We do so for a very wide range of different organisations and industries. We have a product management framework which you can read about on our website that helps product managers deliver products to market faster and also manage products while they're in their existing life cycle for greater success. As part of our training organisation, we've trained over 3,000 product professionals in Australia, New Zealand and Singapore for some of Australia's and the region's largest organisations. So if you're interested in learning more about our training, please get in contact with me after the discussion. One of the reasons why we put this particular presentation together was the question around the challenges of startups getting started in the first place. And this is one of the mission quotes we started this presentation off with. We've witnessed firsthand that the biggest single issue Australian startups face early on is finding their product market fit. And this is a statement that really is reflected by many organisations around the world. So when we think about this, one of the important things to consider is, well, what is product market fit and how do we find it? So in this session, I want to talk about the data and the qualitative criteria that define viable products in the marketplace. I want to talk about some of the analytics and metrics that you need to consider before attaining product market fit, and also what metrics matter once you've started growing. So the first point is we should probably define what product market fit is. Product market fit was first, I think, identified by Mark Andreessen from the Andreessen Horowitz organization. And he kind of described it as being something that you're not quite sure what it is, but you know when you have it. Now, for me, that's not a particularly useful definition. So here's my definition. Product market fit means that a sizable group of people have found enough value in your product to exchange something for it. And it's this concept of a value exchange which is more important. It doesn't necessarily mean a minimum viable product or the smallest part of a product you can get to market, but that a large enough group of people have found value in whatever you're offering. When we apply this thinking to the product lifecycle curve, we can see that there's 5 stages to the life cycle: development, introduction, growth, maturity and decline. This is a pretty well-known model, and if you're not familiar with it, I certainly recommend digging into it in more detail. But the key point that we think about when we think about product market fit is in this inflection point between introduction and growth. For a product that's in introduction, there's uncertainty in the market. You're not quite sure if people want it. You're often iterating rapidly to try and find out what the right mix is. But when you hit it, when you achieve this point of product market fit, you suddenly start to see your product growing. You see more people chasing after your product. It's now the right market and the right product to start seeing that growth kick off. Now, to achieve product market fit, you need this concept called traction. You need to start seeing people actively using your product and using it over and over again. So traction, when we talk about it for a startup business, is a measure of a product's engagement with the market. And what's really important, this is a a quote from Venture Hacks, is that investors care about traction over everything else. So if you want to create a business or a startup that other investors will get involved in, then demonstrating traction for your product is an incredibly important concept that product market fit is going to help be a guide for. Now, to bring in yet another model already for this concept of traction is a concept called the pirate metrics, or AARRR, because we all love talking like a pirate. And what this acronym stands for is essentially an acquisition funnel for bringing customers in. And unfortunately, a lot of the time when you're a startup, your focus tends to be on acquiring new customers and getting new customers and thinking that we can grow that way. But in fact, the opposite is true. When you first start with a new product, getting lots and lots of customers in isn't actually a pathway to success. Getting a handful of customers that stay there and are willing to exchange money or some other value with you is actually far more important. And so the acronym AARRR stands for acquisition, which is a growth metric; activation, which is where you're converting someone from being interested into a customer; retention, which is mean they've stuck with your product and they're doing something with it; revenue, which means you're getting something in return; and referral, which means that they're a valuable mouthpiece for your product afterwards. And this comes from the model that Dave McClure from 500 Startups put together some years ago now. But the key areas we're going to start talking about here are the two traction metrics, which of retention and revenue. That if you don't have one customer who is staying with you and is willing to exchange value, there's no point getting more and more customers onto your product or platform before you start. So these two indicators, these metrics of retention and revenue, can be described as a simple formula. You'll get retention with your product if you have a created value that is greater than the captured value, i.e. if the customer is getting more from it than that you're charging them or they have to exchange for it, then they're going to keep coming back for it. So if they're actively using your product over an extended period of time, or if they're choosing to use your product over other alternatives, they're changing their behavior, you'll see retention. And if they're exchanging something of value more than once, which might be their money, it might be their time, it might be their attention, these are the sort of things that represent retention. So something like Facebook, for example, doesn't cost you anything, but if you're using it more and more and you're changing your behavior to use it where previously you weren't, then that represents a retention. And Facebook's a platform that has one of the best retention metrics on the planet. But retention is not enough. If you want your product to be successful and to actually have a business that represents that success, you also need to capture value from your customers. And so that captured value comes in the form of revenue of some sort. It means you're getting paid in some way and you found a business model that is actually returning money to the business. That can be direct revenue, it can be indirect revenue, it can be advertising revenue, but it's something that's demonstrating that you're getting paid for delivering value to your customers. So when we think about these two metrics, these two traction metrics, these are things that happen before we have product market fit. And we need to experiment to try and find the right metrics and to find that retention revenue to demonstrate that we're getting closer to product market fit. So here's the pathway to product market fit. What we have to do before we get product market fit is essentially recognize that we probably got it wrong the first time we released our product. And so we have to optimize for fast learning. When you first launch a product, don't expect to get it right. Expect to get it wrong, but learn to optimize quickly. If we can learn fast from putting our product into the marketplace and then pivot or change either the product or the market, we can quickly move to a point where customers are willing to adopt our product and we can generate revenue from it. So Paul Graham from Y Combinator in the US says, if you want to achieve product market fit, it seems pretty obvious, make things that people want. And things that people want are things that solve a problem for them. Now, here's one of the mistakes that people often make when iterating on their product. or trying to find product market fit. There's two parts to this concept of a product and market fit. There's the product, which is the part that you control. Then there's the market, the part you don't control. So you could keep changing the thing that you can control, but if the market isn't right for you, you can keep changing your product as much as you like, but if you don't understand the market, you're always going to fail. So the first place to start experimenting is actually to experiment in your understanding of the marketplace. So in that experimentation, you're going to have to create experiments to find out whether you've got the right product, whether you've got the right market, and keep experimenting to fail and then learn, fail and then learn, fail and learn, and eventually you'll succeed and you'll learn. Now, the importance of this thinking is not that we're failing fast, but that we're experimenting and learning fast. So during your introduction stage, you want to really try and find ways of creating cheap, iterative products that you can deliver to the marketplace to learn with a small number of customers as quickly as possible. Every time you get a success, you can build on that success and start to both change your product and your marketplace definition as you go along. So when we look at our model to essentially create customer value, the only way to create customer value is to try and solve a problem in the marketplace. So part of our experimentation, the purpose of the experimentation, is to try and find a marketplace which is big enough that has a problem that no one else is solving that is actually worth solving in the marketplace. And if we can identify that, the next thing to do is to find out if they would actually pay money for it or exchange something of value to have that problem solved. So if you can find that, that's kind of the very first step. Don't start thinking about your product. Don't start coming up with cool new solutions. Start thinking about a marketplace first and find out whether there's a problem worth solving in that marketplace that if you could solve it, they would exchange some value for. And if you want to dig into this in a bit more detail, you can go to brainmates.com.au and have a look at the About Us section that describes our product management model in a bit more detail. Other books that also talk about this. There's the classic book from Steve Blank called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany that was first written in around about 2001 that talks about customer discovery. Building on that, in around about 2006 was the first edition of Eric Ries's book, The Lean Startup, that talks about this value hypothesis and the learn, build, measure loop to deliver a minimum viable product. All of these talk about this process of understanding your marketplace first and then building a minimum viable product to test that marketplace. And further to that, Ash Muria talks about the concept of running lean in his book and introduces the idea of a lean canvas to capture some of these things. So these are great books to have a look at that capture this idea of marketplace discovery and also trying to find that first product market fit. But we're not done yet. There's still more to this story. If you actually achieve product market fit, and that's by no means a simple thing to do, we want to do that by experimenting with the marketplace, experimenting with our product, and trying to find the right balance of the two. The next thing to do is to recognize that we don't just have to do it once, we actually have to do it twice. So when thinking about your market, assuming you've identified a marketplace which has a sizable enough problem that you care about, that if you solved it would solve an important problem for them and they'd exchange some value for it, you want to try and think, well, how big is that total marketplace? Then you're not going to get all of that market, so think about what percentage of that marketplace. Again, this is the maximum amount you think you can capture. It'll include all of the possible customers. That's your nirvana. That's the high point that you'll be reaching. If we then plot that on a graph and look at over here the mark where there's 100% of that market has been achieved, you're at 0% now, and over time you hope eventually to get to 100% of that growth by growing your product and growing that marketplace and expanding to your market share. So that's essentially where we are as a startup. You start off with no customers and you hope to grow that into a large enough marketplace. But it's not quite as simple as that. In general, there's actually usually an S-curve that applies to this. So you start off a little bit slower, then you rapidly accelerate your growth over a period of time. And as you achieve a high percentage of market penetration, things slow down and you end up tapering off towards that 100% mark. Now, it's interesting because this also maps to another really important model called the customer adoption curve. This is where we talk about different types of customers that can be called innovators, early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and sometimes the laggards, the people who are barely using your product in the long term. Now, when we start off targeting the innovators and the early adopters. These are the people who will start off using your product when no one else is willing to try it out. They'll try new technology and they'll give it a go. But we don't really hit the real product market fit until you reach the early majority customers. Now, what's important to know is that these are two very different types of customers by their behavior. They might have very similar characteristics for every other sort of market segmentation criteria you might pick, but the one thing that makes them different is the way they behave when it comes to trying something new versus trying something which has been tested by somebody else. So this customer adoption curve, when we look at it, is made up of these different groups of people. And what's important to note here is that the early group of customers actually represents a fairly small group compared to the rest of the customers. Remembering that all of the customers under this curve here represent 100% of your overall market. And we don't get to the real product market fit until we get to the early majority. Now, there's another challenge here. I'm full of challenges for you. But the other challenge we have is that between the early adopters, there is a concept called the chasm. This was initially talked about by Geoffrey Moore in his book called Crossing the Chasm, a great book that talks about this in a lot more detail. But the challenge here is that the gap between early adopters and early majority is quite significant in their behavior. And because their behaviors are different, we actually have to satisfy a product market fit for both groups so that we can cross that chasm and make sure we're building the right product for the marketplace. So for startups, we have to think about these two groups as essentially two stages of achieving product market fit. We have to get product market fit first for the innovators and the early adopters, but then we have to get product market fit again for the second group of customers. And so while the product won't be completely different, there will be differences in the way that we present that product to the marketplace. So the two markets we have to target, or we have to think about, is firstly the early adopters and then the early majority. We can leave the late majority and the laggards for later on once we have majority market share. But the two that we need to think about for startups are the early adopter markets and the early majority. And here's how they're different. So the innovators, these are the people who will take risks. They're often younger, they can afford to fail, and quite frankly, these people are crazy. These are the people who got into an Uber car before anybody knew what an Uber was. They're willing to hop into a ride with some stranger on basis of having heard about the idea as being cool and interesting. Once we get those innovators, quite often they'll provide feedback and tell the early adopters that there's something interesting. The early adopter group are careful risk takers. They'll experiment with stuff still before the majority of people have, but they'll be a little bit more cautious about it. What's really important about these people is that these are the opinion leaders. These are the people that the early majority will listen to when they ask, should I try this? If the early adopters say yes, then there's a higher chance or a higher probability that the product will take off. If we don't get the early adopters to buy into it, the product was very unlikely to succeed in the long term. Excuse me. The early majority won't try anything unless they've had some validation of it before by somebody else. They'll consider their actions. They won't try anything particularly new, but they represent for a product the big bulk of the customers. So we have to win them over if our product's going to be successful. And what's really important is that the early majority listen to the early adopters to guide them and influence them accordingly. why is this relevant to getting to product market fit? Well, it's really important because we have to get to this concept of product market fit twice. We have to do it for the early adopter and we have to do it for the early majority. It means that when we think about rolling your product out for the first time or even rolling out a new feature of your product for the first time, the very first people that we have to target will be the innovators. You might offer your first minimum viable product to a customer that represents your overall target market, but is the innovator type of this product. For these people, you want to get their early feedback. These people won't pay attention for long. They'll go off to the next shiny thing, they'll move to something else. You won't keep their attention for long, but you do need their feedback. But remember, they don't represent your overall marketplace. Once you're comfortable that the innovators are giving you some valuable feedback, you can move on to the early adopters, where you can then move on and start to iterate both the customer types you're targeting and also the product you're delivering to them. And this is where your minimum viable product iterations are going to be really important. And if things start taking off there, if you start seeing adoption, if you start seeing the opportunity to pay you something or to exchange their time and attention, then you know you're heading in the right direction. So you don't really care about acquiring lots and lots of new customers yet. What you really care about is seeing the customers that you have actively using your product in the way that you intended, or learning from the way they use your product and potentially shaping your product based on their usage. Once you have confidence that the early adopters are using your product, you now need to turn those people into mouthpieces, into megaphones, so that they can share your idea with the early majority. We want to use those early adopters as testimonials, as referrals, to try and get those early majority customers to start using your product. We want to use success with your early adopter customers to attract the early majority, and then start learning from the way your early majority customers start to behave. We still need to find that product market fit, and we still need to get over the gap. So if you get to product market fit, the key learning I want you to think about here is, if you get to product market fit with your early adopters, don't stop. You've only gotten halfway there. In fact, if you look at the percentage of customers that represent the innovators and early adopters, it's generally considered to be around about 16% of your overall marketplace. You've still got the bulk of your customers to try and win over. To really get product market fit, you need to get the second group of people, the early majority, which represent the bulk of your customers. If you win them over, you'll generally see a massive spike in growth, and you'll start to really see the product take off from there. So this is where we come back to those traction metrics. In both cases, we want to demonstrate that retention has been achieved by creating more value for your customers than the competing alternatives, and more value that's greater than the cost of attaining that value. Similarly, we want to demonstrate that we've got a business model that is returning revenue to the organisation, either directly or indirectly. But if you're simply costing the business money by serving your customers and there's no pathway to revenue, then you haven't ticked off both of those traction metrics that are so important for a growing business, and important particularly if you're interested in getting funding from investors. Now, assuming you've achieved product market fit, where your product satisfies a market in a way that's now growing, the key thing now is to remember that you've got to keep going. Achieving product market fit can be a fleeting moment if we're not careful. So the thing to hang on to here is, or to remember, is to hang on. I need to optimize for growth. I need to scale the business. Growth itself can be scary, as suddenly you've got more customers than you thought you had, and you need to make sure your business can scale with that. The other thing that will happen during your growth stage is competitors will come in copying what you're doing. So don't lose your product market fit to a competitor. Keep growing the product. Keep thinking of new ways to solve new problems for your customer. Once you've achieved product market fit, you can stop changing the product and refocus on the other parts of that growth of the pirate metrics for growing a product in the market. Once you've confirmed that customers will stay with you, that they'll exchange value, then you can start pumping your growth metrics, which are growing acquisition, improving the activation process, making that a faster and faster process, and then turning the customers that you have into referrers that will feed back into that loop and make acquisition even more powerful. But don't focus on those things until after you've achieved product market fit and you can see your product growing in the marketplace. So just to wrap up, the checklist for product market fit. Step 1, find a market before you start worrying about finding a problem. Sorry, find a market before you start trying to worry about a solution. Identify a problem in that market that's actually worth solving. And often the two of those things will be very closely related. Develop a minimum viable product to solve it. Try and work out the minimum set of product functionality you can deliver to that customer group so you can test whether or not you actually can create value for them. Once you've done that, see if you can find a business model that will support it. How are you going to get paid? How are you going to actually create a model that will allow the business and the product to be sustainable? Use that knowledge to test and measure and learn from the market you've already got to try and find that point of traction, and then repeat until you have a product that starts to grow organically on its own. And remember, you have to do it twice. And now I'm going to open up for questions from my team here.
Thanks, Nick. That was awesome. Definitely very good to know for anybody who's trying to actually start a marketplace or do their own business or start their own business. So we have some questions that I think will hopefully help everyone get going and hopefully make a product that's actually usable and has a market fit. All right. So in your experience, where do you think that people tend to get stuck at? What's the most common place that people tend to have issues or obstacles when trying to find their product market fit?
Well, I think if we take both sides of that, the product and the market. So one of the first obstacles to the product market fit is thinking you know who your market is. People often will assume they know who the market is. They will assume they know who their customers are, and they'll assume they know what customer problems they have. But until they actually, and to quote again the Eric Ries and Steve Blank's books, until they leave the building and actually go out and speak to customers and observe what they're doing, they're just making stuff up. And when you think about how much you're likely to invest over the life of that product before it goes to market, that's an incredibly big risk to take before you have a level of confidence that it's actually a valuable problem worth solving. The other mistake that people often make is they overinvest in product design before they've validated those customer problems. So as early as possible, you want to try and find out, A, are you wrong? What bit did you get wrong? And find the cheapest and fastest way of doing that. And often, most of the solutions we'll come up with will actually be wrong to some extent. And it's not until we actually start iterating very, very quickly on both our understanding of the customer and also the way the potential product might work that we get closer to de-risking our idea and actually solving it more effectively.
Nice. Oh, so I guess what would you say is the most minimal of a minimal viable product that you can create?
Well, it actually depends on the experiment you're trying to test. So at the very earliest stages, even before you've built a product, you might be trying to test whether there's actually a valid value proposition. So you might actually put out to try and determine whether your value proposition makes any sense, whether the customer that you've identified has the problem. You might just start off with interviewing them. You might put up a Facebook ad and see if people click on it with a sort of a marketing claim or a value proposition on it. Similarly, you might put a Google ad to do the same thing. And all of those would tend to start to give you a sense of whether or not your relatively low investment in a market claim would resonate with the marketplace. And if you think long term, if you can't get your advertising to work even before you have a product, there's very little point in advertising it after you've built the product when it gets particularly expensive. Other examples could be trying to test price points. So having the sort of fake landing pages, these the concept of a landing page that talks about a price point and as a fake buy now button to encourage people to demonstrate their willingness to pay for things is a good way of sort of testing some of those things. Even the equivalent of a Kickstarter campaign is good because you're actually asking people to part with real money before a real product exists. So even though you may or may not actually be trying to seek investment that way, what you can do with some of the Kickstarter-like processes is to test whether there is an early adopter desire to actually buy the product even before a product exists. And then to actually test a physical product, don't worry about the back-end wiring and databases and platforms to make everything work. Simply create some fakeware to test with one or two customers whether it could work, whether your interface might work, whether the environment you want the product to be in might actually work, and see if you can test some very lightweight prototypes to see whether the interactions that you're putting to customers can actually work in the environments that the customers are in to create value to solve the problem they had in the first place. So there's lots of different types of minimal product that you can use to test and validate a particular assumption.
Nice. So I guess also on the topic of feedback that you said that was very important. And then, you have your two-prong, basically, marketplace fit. How do you differentiate good feedback from like crazy person feedback?
I think it's there's often in the crazy person feedback, there's insights there that if you drill into them, represent an extreme set of behavior, but often the extremes can help drive your product innovation. And so sometimes extreme behavior can be the bleeding edge of a future innovation. So another example of that could be mountain bike riding. So when mountain bikes were first being developed, or when people were looking for new marketplaces for mountain bikes, they found people who were doing crazy things with things that weren't mountain bikes. They were reinforcing them. They were trying to make them more ruggedized so they could hurl themselves down a mountainside and hopefully not kill themselves. What the bike manufacturers identified there was a new market opportunity from the extreme sports people to then take that sort of ruggedized standard bike and turn it into a brand new market that supported a whole bunch of people. So while the crazy people, while the extremes of your sort of overall marketplace interviewing may not be representative of your entire market, be careful not to discount them because they may actually be really good indicators of future innovation. So that's probably how I'd answer that. But also listen to all of them, recognize whether that person that you're talking to is in fact a part of your desired target market, or whether they represent an innovator in your target market, or perhaps they're just a completely crazy person and you might actually choose.
Okay, so not all crazy people are crazy, but some might be.
Correct.
I guess I would be remiss not to ask some product management questions because
Sure.
I'm sure that everybody has, product managers and product management, I feel like are now such a hot topic. And so kind of just switching hats a little bit. And just to get your opinion, what do you think that the key differentiators are between, a good product management or a product manager versus a great one? Like, how do you make it so that you are, at the top of the game and making sure that your business is really moving forward well?
So I think the difference between a good product manager and a great product manager, number one, this probably won't surprise you, is that a great product manager knows their customers and their marketplace and is in constant communication with them. And so a good product manager might be very aware of their product. They might be a subject matter expert. They might have spoken to a customer once in the past, but they haven't done it for a while. A great product manager has created opportunities to be constantly in contact with their customer base. Another attribute of a great product manager is that they're a really good communicator. It means that they can communicate to their stakeholders. So their stakeholders both upstream to the executive channel, but also downstream to the operational parts of the business. And they can do that proactively rather than just reactively. So they're not responding to requests for information. They're producing information that's consumed by other parts of the business. And they're probably communicating more than they think they need to, but it's just enough to keep the business happy. And I think probably a third attribute of a product manager is they understand the money. They understand the financials of the product. And it's interesting that a lot of the time, this whole idea of talking about the money for a product seems very almost an untouchable subject, but fundamentally that's the whole point of having a product. If you have a product and it's not generating revenue or something sustainable for the business, then you shouldn't have the product in the first place. And so a product manager who understands both what the financial goals are of the product and what the costs are that are required to deliver that product, and how that overall product is then contributing to the financial success of the organisation, is also a product manager who really can communicate, but particularly up to the executive channel, who might think, look, it's lovely you put that feature on, but how much money did I just make? We find that product managers who are not financially literate, who don't like talking about the money aspects of it, kind of put themselves below a glass ceiling where they simply can't move beyond. Product managers who can talk the finance and talk about the money of their product and their business create greater career growth opportunities for themselves into other sort of general manager and eventually even CEO roles.
Nice. So you mentioned, okay. So you mentioned constant communication between product management or product manager and the users. What's the best way to facilitate this? Is this through your customer service? Like, how important is the team versus the actual product manager getting out there? Like, what are the processes that can be put in place so that there is that constant communication loop?
At a minimum, I would say that creating an opportunity for the product manager themselves, not through a secondary medium, to have an opportunity to speak with, formally or informally, their customers that they're directly serving. So something that we do, because our customers are product managers, is that we run meetups. And so we have product managers come into our meetups and we create opportunities to speak socially with them and hear about their particular challenges and problems. Other times we'll interview them individually and have conversations with them to ask about, what first got them on the pathway to doing a product manager training course, so we can understand their buyer journey and the barriers and issues that came in there. But these things don't come out, but no one sends us a letter to tell us their problems. We have to go in search of that information and find out what that is. There's nothing wrong with using your customer support teams and sales teams as pathways to get in contact with customers or to listen to the marketplace. But often what you hear from those sources will be lagging indicators that there's a problem or an opportunity. The salespeople will say, I can't sell your product, it's too expensive, even if it's free, because they've been unable to identify a strong market or articulate a value proposition clearly. If people are calling your customer support desk for help, then there's clearly a problem that exists, and it's almost too late to get in front of it to talk to that particular customer. You need to almost go beyond that and understand why do they need to call customer support at all. So they can be useful to get indicators, but to really understand customers, we have to create time to speak to them. So I'd say if you're not performing a customer interview at least once a month, preferably once a week, then you're going to struggle to become a great product manager.
Got it. Customer feedback, extremely important. Looking at the product, the life cycle that you have on Brainmates,
yep.
At what steps would you say that people get stuck on the most? And then what would you say are the steps that people tend to overlook the most?
The two are closely related. So where they get stuck the most is in the what we call our define stage and our build stage, which are about 2/3 of the way around. And the reason they get stuck there is because of your other half of your question of what they haven't done. So what often happens is people have an idea, They'll go, that's great, let's do it. And there'll be this rush to build something really, really quickly. And so when they get to the build stage, they'll start with the build, and then someone will ask the question, oh, hang on, what type of phone is our customer using? And everyone will look at each other blankly and go, we're not sure. And then they'll ask the product manager, hey, what type of phone are they using? And the product manager will go, well, you didn't ask me that before, so I don't have the details. So Netley, go and do some research. Now that takes time. And so all of these little questions that come out of the build stage, if we can preemptively answer them at earlier stages, it may feel like it's delaying things before we start, but it's actually sort of supercharging the build effort so that if someone asks a question, we've already got the answer. And there's a balancing act between those two things. But we find that in our model, the yellow stage, the innovate phase of taking an idea, exploring it in the marketplace first to find out whether there's actually a need for it. And if it's not, throw it away quickly and start again. Then finding out when in the focus stage whether it's actually worth doing for the business. So is there any money to be made or any opportunity to be created, is a really important starting point for any idea, big or small. Because if you come up with an idea during the build stage, or really at any stage, and nobody does it and it won't money, then it's pretty simple decision to make, which is don't do it. If on the other hand, you identify an opportunity, it makes sense and you can make money out of it, then you prioritize it with other things that might also help you. So that upfront work in our methodology of identifying a customer need, identifying a business opportunity for that need, immersing yourself in the customer experience to understand the customer problem sufficiently is sort of the first half of our methodology. That provides you the superpowers and the right information to be able to go through and then define the right solution and then build it quickly and then market it to the marketplace more effectively. So build is where people get stuck. They get stuck because they haven't done the first part, which is identifying the customer problem in the first place effectively.
So I guess we cannot underline the importance of actually knowing what the problem is and defining it. Last question, Nick. What inspires you?
What inspires me as a product person is knowing that the products that we're creating today are creating the future of tomorrow. When we think about the supercomputers that we carry around in our pockets that we can't imagine living without now, these are things that were created essentially by product people who identified a number of problems to solve, have solved them, and now we're completely dependent on the products that we work with every day. So to me, that's what inspires me to be at that connection between the problems of the future and the solutions of today, to bring those together to create great products that customers love.
Well, thank you so much again, Nick. It was great having you. If anybody has any questions, just feel free to email him. And that's all we have for today. Thank you again.